Someone like Reagan, whenever he talked about Silicon Valley, would hold it up as this is the American dream in action. These young guys in garages changing the world, and this is what free enterprise can give you. There was very little acknowledgement of the broader state actors that helped make it happen.
Hi, I'm Taylor Owen, and this is Big Tech.
At a certain point, really what you're doing is capital allocation. And it does not make sense to take the job of capital allocation away from people who have demonstrated great skill in capital allocation and give it to an entity that has demonstrated very poor skill in capital allocation, which is the government.
That's Elon Musk talking to the Wall Street Journal about why he shouldn't be paying higher taxes. Musk's beliefs about government are pretty common in Silicon Valley, where people tend to believe that innovation is driven exclusively by the free market, and that the best thing government can do is to cut red tape, lower taxes, and really just stay out of the way. But even if that's widely regarded as gospel among tech people, it's far from accurate. Margaret O'Mara is a professor of American history at the University of Washington and the author of The Code. And in her telling of the Valley's history, technological innovation has always been the result of a symbiotic relationship between entrepreneurs and the government. The idea that the government is an obstacle to innovation is just one of the many myths about the Valley that she debunks in her book. Margaret and I cover a lot of ground here, more than 80 years of history. But running through it all is a sense that we've been here before. The debate about government regulation, the influence of geopolitics on technology, the utopian rhetoric around things like Web3 are all things that have historical precedents. And there's a lot to be gained from peering back in time and seeing how we grappled with them 60 or 70 years ago. In fact, the best way forward might actually be to spend some time reflecting on the past. Here's my conversation with Margaret O'Mara. I was watching some of the press around this book, and it seems like you gave a lot of talks to VCs and in Silicon Valley, and I'm wondering how they react to the narrative you lay out in this project.
Well, it's interesting because there's not a lot of broader understanding of the longer and wider history. When I started studying the history of Silicon Valley, which was 20 years ago, I would get a lot of pushback to my, talking about the longer history of public spending and the role of government. And it's been a very entrepreneurial story. It's been one in which many in the Valley consider this the ultimate example of free market capitalism in action, American capitalism with few strings attached. And what I really wanted to do in this book was show that it was a yes and story, that it was neither a story of freewheeling entrepreneurs with no government in sight, nor was it one of government doing it all. It was a really distinctive combination that the United States does and has done throughout its history, because we fear actually having big government, obviously big government, even though we build very big government down here. And from 1789 forward, from the age of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, the U.S. has grown its state by subsidizing private industry in many instances, whether you're building canals and railroads in the 19th century or building internet industries in the 20th and 21st. It's a very similar model. So I think that there's a recognition that there's a bigger story here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the mythologies that emerges from Silicon Valley isn't just that they're separate from the state. It's that the state itself hinders the kind of development they do. It's like antagonistic to the state. And yet it is intertwined, as you say, as the railways were and the aerospace industry was. They are as intertwined and a function of exactly that connection that you just mentioned. But they are antagonistic to it. Like, what's the origin of that?
Yeah. Well, business, all types of business and business leaders are, will be quick to say, oh, the regulations get in our way, the taxes get in our way. That's that binary.
But Boeing doesn't claim it's like totally separate from the state, right? Like they kind of own a bit of that.
Yeah. And And I think tech is really interesting in that so much of its definition of itself is building these companies and defining them as something different than the typical corporate America. And you see this from the very beginning, where Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett establish HP, and they talk starting in the 50s about management by wandering around, and we don't have corner offices, and we have a much more egalitarian atmosphere. And it was really very consciously separating themselves as a different kind of kinder, gentler capitalism. And this continues through generation after generation of companies. And in differentiating themselves, they're also saying, we do what we do because the government gets out of the way. And in the case of tech, I think a good shorthand of the American technology industry is, yes, indeed, the government got out of the way. But first, it sent a heap of resources in the industry's direction. First, in terms of spending on research and education and being a customer for these high-tech projects. But even in the last 40 years, where there isn't so much obvious defense work, although there's quite a bit these days, but even when that is not quite as central to the story, you have tax policy and regulatory policy that is that is state action too. Deregulation, the choice not to make a certain group of industries adhere to something like, the very loosely regulated internet, social media economy that the United States allowed to flourish. That was a policy choice. That was government action.
I mean, that's what's fascinating though, right? Because like Section 230, for example, is an act of state regulation that empowered tech, didn't disempower them, right? It gave them a platform on which to grow. Via state regulation, right?
Absolutely. And it was one done with tech interests and industries lobbying for that. They had a hand in its creation. They've not been passive actors. That's the other mythos that the industry has cultivated, is that we don't really care about politics, and we just, stay away from Washington, and it doesn't matter to us. And I don't, there are plenty of instances of tech executives and venture capitalists going to Capitol Hill and going to the White House and working very hard to make sure that the policy landscape is working in their favor.
I mean, going back a bit further, I was wondering, reading through that, the history of the Cold War spending into tech, whether some of this might have been an explicit strategy by the government to look distant from it. So if you're trying to show that you're different than the Soviet Union, this big statist enterprise, the last thing you want to do is show you're building up a statist industrial complex as well. And yet you need state funding. So what do? You put it to universities, you give it to corporations in different ways, and you kind of propagate this entrepreneurial mythology yourself. Is that part of this too? Was that an ideological play by the U.S. government as well?
Yeah, bingo. Yeah, this is all revving up and going into overdrive in the 1950s, the age of McCarthyism, the age when the U.S. is defining itself against Soviet socialism, and collectivist enterprise is very much out of style. And so spending a lot, but doing it indirectly, the money flows. Yes, there's the buildup of federally controlled research entities, but more significantly, there's a lot of money to private industry, defense contractors. And then there's a lot of money that flows to research universities, public and private. There's a transformation in the relationship between higher education and the U.S. government around 1950. It's not just the GI Bill, which is sending many, many thousands, ultimately millions of veterans to college, but it is also money flowing into science and technology programs and building out science and technology programs. And so much of this growth happens under the watch of Dwight Eisenhower, who was a small government conservative and was so disquieted by, exactly as you put it, understood, he was a military man, he understood the geopolitical stakes, the need for it. There was also an economic reason for it too. All of this spending, this was Keynesianism in action. This was the last thing the U.S. wanted to do was go back to the Great Depression. And there was an understanding among presidents and their economic advisors that the thing that got the U.S. out of the Depression was not only the spending of the New Deal in the 1930s, but particularly World War II. So defense spending as an engine of job creation, economic growth, regional redistribution of jobs and economic activity. It grew the Sun Belt in the West, and whole parts of the United States that were not industrial became more industrialized thanks to defense.
And still is, obviously, as you mentioned. And I mean, I'm just stuck on this tension between support and benefiting from, and antagonism to. And because it comes up repeatedly in different moments. And I feel like we're in one again now when you look at like people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, who have like not just antagonism to the state, but like an aggression and a deeply ideological or libertarian view of themselves that is very distant from the reality of their businesses, which are both. I mean, Palantir is 90% of its revenue comes from the national security state, and Tesla is supported through subsidies, and SpaceX is a contractor for the government. I mean, how do you explain that, the starkness of that disconnect now?
I know. It's really stark. Well, I think it's building on kind of a half century plus of, again, a cognitive dissonance that is very deeply, deeply held, where you have, it's not just techno-libertarianism, which is let's have as little government as possible, but it's also, I think, if we really dig down into what are the politics of the Valley, first of all, the Valley, the industry contains multitudes. There are people who are liberal, people who are conservative, all sorts of things. But there is, I think, the kind of shared faith in the power of technology and the power of technologists as just basically smarter than everyone else. It's somewhat anti-democratic impulse, quite frankly, even though a lot of the rhetoric, not necessarily from people like Thiel and Musk, but from the broader kind of rhetoric of we're making the world a better place and connecting the world, and this is inherently good. And but it is predicated on a notion that this is a very intellectually privileged group of very, very smart people who've spent their whole lives being somewhat either, intellectually exceptional or identified as such. And they've been extremely successful in business, and that's reinforced their sense of, I've got it going on. And it's even though the real story of the tech industry is one that involves many, many people with many different skill sets, it is still a place that then and now really sees engineers as the smartest people in the room. And engineering thinking has this linearity to it. Writing good code is you want clean code, you want to get from A to B as efficiently as possible. And the mess of the real world and politics is often antithetical to that.
Well, it either works or it doesn't too, right? Like it's not only linear, but it progresses and it goes in one direction and it gets better or worse.
It's binary.
Yeah.
And these are deeply held. So and look, Americans have been very good, whether it be politicians like Ronald Reagan, who as president oversaw an enlargement in military spending that had sent a lot of money to not just the tech industry, but to computer science in particular, because so much of what the 1980s military buildup involved things like the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a very elaborate missile defense shield that involved a lot of supercomputing. Never came to pass, but put a lot of money in. But even someone like Reagan, who knew very well this relationship, this symbiotic relationship between the public and private, would talk, whenever he talked about Silicon Valley, would hold it up as this is free market entrepreneurs, the American dream in action, these young guys in garages changing the world. And this is what free enterprise can give you. This is entrepreneurial capitalism. There was very little acknowledgement of the broader state actors that helped make it happen.
Yeah. And yet that's another disconnect or tension that runs through this whole history, is that the politicization of Silicon Valley by Reagan, Clinton, Obama, Bush. I mean, they all saw this as like a powerful political space.
Yeah.
And yet the narrative and myth in Silicon Valley that they were apolitical and that connecting people, like you say, was an apolitical act, that in and of, that's just a good, a sort of universal good, not an act with political consequence or with politics embedded in it. So that's another tension that kind of sits through this history as well.
It does. It's this not wanting to take sides. We're eliminating gatekeepers. We're creating the free flow of information. We're going to let people decide for themselves whether it's good or bad, and rather than telling them what to think, telling them that's the way it is, like Walter Cronkite used to do on the CBS Evening News. Instead, we're just going to give you everything and open it up. And there's a kind of earnest optimism that fuels that in the beginning. And I think this idea, this particular variety of that idea, has its roots in the late 60s and 1970s with the group of kind of baby boom era, Vietnam War era young people who start tinkering around with personal computers and start talking about the idea of putting a computer on every desk and connecting them through wires. And that's going to be the way to achieve all of the goals of the new left of the 1960s. We're going to get to the dream that way. And it's very techno optimistic and presumes that connecting people will bring only good. And it's brought a lot of good. It's also, when you put all of humanity online, the good, bad, and the ugly all come out. And when you put them in an algorithmically mediated environment in platforms that are intended to grow as quickly as possible and monetize data as much as possible, then it becomes an information environment that can privilege the angriest voices and the loudest voices in the room. And we've seen that proliferate.
Of course,
but
yeah.
it comes from a kind of interesting, again, you can't delink any of this stuff from a broader history. It's a history of a generation disillusioned by American leadership because of how the war in Vietnam went, disillusioned by Watergate and Nixon, a loss of faith in institutions, big business, big government, big everything, and trying to craft a new world that was a kind of small is beautiful, entrepreneurial, everyone's got a voice. But that, again, not taking sides. And we're seeing now these companies have enormous power and are being asked to make political choices and have, because they have great influence.
Yeah, I teach a class on media and politics and digital technology and politics, and I always, in week one, we always read the Declaration of Cyberspace, like the Perry Barlow's thing, and it's a remarkable document for what it captures. But the idea that is not a political statement is absurd. That is as political a manifesto as one can imagine. But what I don't think I fully realized until reading the way you connect this history and the previous era is that it seems to me that they wanted to build personal computers to empower users, and that was in opposition in some ways to the way computers had been centralized before in industry and the state. But it seems to me they also saw the power of those computers through the war, right? They saw how powerful these mainframes were and the destruction, really. And so that gave them this ideology against the war and against the state, but also drove their desire to bring them to more people because they just saw how powerful they fundamentally were. And I don't know, I thought it was a really interesting transition in that very sort of niche group of people who saw both the 50s war use and then the transition to personal computers. They seem like a very particular bunch there.
They are a very particular bunch, and it is an extraordinary sort of generational story. The irony, of course, is that the baby boom generation, the young people that are going to places like Berkeley and Stanford in the late 60s, particularly those who are going to a public university like Berkeley, they are directly beneficiaries of this huge public wave of Cold War spending that is not just spending on defense, but it's also building those computer labs at universities. It's subsidizing both federal and state spending that's subsidizing higher education so that back then one could go to Berkeley for $50 a semester effectively. And they're exposed to computing in college. They, at the same time, they're marching out of the computer lab onto the plaza to protest the war, seeing that, the power of computers, what they can do, and so frustrated that all of that power is contained in the computer labs of the establishment and being used, so much of it being used to wage war. And then they graduate. They don't have much debt because they had this very low cost higher education. And they don't want to work in defense contracting. So they end up going to, and this is in the early 70s, that's why you see all of these extraordinary people go to places like Xerox PARC, which is the research lab in Palo Alto that the Xerox Corporation sets up. And they're also kicking around in garages, playing with, building their own motherboards and building their own personal computers. So they have this economic freedom as well as political. They've been transformed by what they've seen and they've done. Of course, it doesn't take that long for this movement, the personal computer movement, this idea that we're going to find these machines can be empowering and change education and all those do-goodery things. In the span of about 48 months, it's turned into a personal computer industry. They're starting to sell and market them. And of course, a few of these garage entrepreneurs very early on set their sights on becoming quite big. And most notably, Steve Jobs, who knew in 1976 that they were going to get out of the garage. This wasn't just a movement. This was a big deal.
Yeah, but to do so in a slightly different way than sort of Bill Gates was at the time too, who I think probably had more of that large-scale industrial idea right from the beginning.
Yeah, Bill Gates never styled himself quite as much of a countercultural guy.
Yeah.
But it's so Gates was interesting and distinctive in that what he and Paul Allen were doing, where they were building something to sell that previously had been given away for free, which was the software that goes with the computer. So in the old days of IBM and the mainframe computing, the companies would just send along the software along with when you lease the giant computer, the software and the services kind of come along with part of your purchase price. There wasn't a standalone software industry per se. And certainly not for personal computing, where all of these early personal computer evangelists, they were hardware guys. And if you were really serious, you knew how to write your own operating system or write your own apps. And then you also shared the code. You swapped it. So they had these newsletters where they just write out, like, here's how you program.
Yeah, and shared it for free.
Shared it for free. And Gates and Allen were selling it. And so this is the beginning of the ongoing war between proprietary and open source software that continues to this day.
Another thing that kind of struck me in this evolution from moments where there was large-scale state funding versus moments where the markets provided a lot of the capital influx. In the dot-com boom, you see the government sort of step back a little bit and a VC culture emerge. And then the government sort of comes back in at various times. And it feels like now maybe we're back in one of those VC moments. But I'm wondering if that's right, if you have these kind of waves of government influx of cash versus the market doing it. And if that's the case, do they build different things when the source of the money is different? Like does a VC funded company build something different than a state funded industry?
Well, I would call it generational, and I would say that they kind of grow side by side, and maybe the two kind of wax and wane. So you start in the 50s and 60s with miniaturized electronics, transistorized electronics, semiconductors, silicon semiconductors, integrated circuits. This is the genesis of the high-tech VC industry, sort of starting in the late 50s and early 60s. It's very small, but they're taking advantage of the fact that the government is pumping all this money into things like integrated circuits, for example, which the market was effectively created in large part by the Apollo program. John Kennedy declares we shall reach the moon by the end of the 1960s. And all of a sudden, there's this intense demand from NASA for these very bespoke, very, very expensive devices manufactured by a handful of companies in this one place. It wasn't even called Silicon Valley yet, but these are the companies that put the silicon in Silicon Valley. And these are companies that are the granddaddies of every venture-backed startup since, notably Fairchild Semiconductor, which is incorporated in the fall of 1957, conveniently only a couple weeks before the Soviets sent Sputnik into orbit, thereby prompting the Eisenhower administration to, if Dwight Eisenhower had hair, it would have lit on fire. They were so freaked out by the fact that the Soviets had beat the US into space. So there's a huge demand created. But VCs are there identifying companies that can grow and then meet this new demand. Then you go into the 70s, you start seeing, the defense spending in the United States goes down after Vietnam. The markets, the public markets are stinking it up in the early 70s. VCs cannot raise funds. There's a lean days. And then that turns around in the late 70s and early 80s with both the further growth of the semiconductor industry and particularly the personal computer industry. So the IPO of Apple in late 1980, which comes only 2 months after the IPO of the first big biotech company, Genentech, those things wake up Wall Street to these new generation industries. And all of a sudden, the markets are very, very go-go for both of these technologies.
And does the state step back a bit in some ways when the market kicks in, or what's the relationship there?
Yeah, but it's not quite now. I mean, there's defense spending kind of happens, waxes and wanes independent of. But the market, there's an interesting, again, it's this fascinating kind of perfect storm of geopolitics, domestic politics, technological inflection points. We get by the late 70s, chips have miniaturized enough that you have these very small circuitry that you can essentially build a board around, put in a wooden box and call it a personal computer, which is essentially what the Apple I was. It looked like the Steves had made it in shop class. It's kind of really sweet, very homebrewed machine. But you finally have gotten to a point where this could become a consumer product. And that's a real turning point, right? So you have enterprise hardware before the 1980s. The things that Silicon Valley sells, they're selling to other companies. It's kind of this mysterious, an average consumer doesn't really know what these products are because you might have a microchip in your car, even in the 1970s, but you don't know that it's there. And then in the early 80s, you have not only these personal computer companies, there's, Atari and, Pong and all these, the young kids kind of getting hooked on video games. And, the other thing that's really important to remember is think about the late 70s, early 80s North American manufacturing economy. It's not great. This is a time of factory closure, and it's really bad news stories. When I was researching, I went on sabbatical and went down to Stanford. One of the perks we had was we could order books from the Stanford libraries. And so I ordered up, and I think the librarians are still mad at me 7 years later, all of the bound copies of Business Week magazine from like 1978 to 1981, wow. Just to page through the physical copies and see what the business zeitgeist was in the U.S.
Pretty dark.
It was really dark. It was a lot of bad news. And then you get to the section that was called information processing, which was where computer hardware and software was. And it was all California sunshine and pool parties and rainbows and growth. So you see this, you can see why politicians of both parties got really, really excited about these industries. And we're working hard to, both Democrats and Republicans, to cut capital gains taxes, because that's what the venture capitalists were arguing they needed to encourage more risk capital investment in these industries.
You mentioned the confluence of a geopolitical moment, a domestic political moment, and a tech inflection, being a spur for some sort of intersection between the state and the industry here. And I wonder if we have all three of those now again. If China, maybe Russia, plus some of the political consequences we've seen of the current state of technologies domestically, plus the emergence of like large-scale computing again in terms of machine learning, cloud storage, quantum computing. Like these aren't personal computing enterprises. These are large-scale industrial projects that might be aligned with geopolitical and domestic interests as well. Like, do you see the transition back to that kind of industrial development?
I think this is this is an interesting moment on many levels, but it is so interesting to see. I think we're at a moment that is both underscoring how powerful the largest technology companies have become. But at the same time, we're also seeing the enduring power of the state, that ultimately the real decider at the end of the day remain nation states, choices to impose sanctions, choices to I think cryptocurrency is a great example of a whole system that whose proponents have really underscored as this is a escape from the global financial system, so to speak. It's an opportunity for small scale investors. It's an opportunity to release the bounds of nation state rules and regulations. But ultimately, if you are, say, a Russian oligarch trying to, you're going to go long on crypto. You sure can. You can keep on buying that up even despite all these sanctions, but you gotta hold it, because the only way you can't trade it for dollars. Like, there's sort of this, and regulatory reality is setting in on, decentralized finance and these new kind of wild west of alternatives. But I think you're right in that we're in this really interesting moment where, and really it's always, I think this has been a constant, it's just more obvious at different moments, where you have, what is shaping the growth of the technology industry, big and small. It is, for these American-based companies, American domestic politics is a shaper. The willingness of the U.S. to invest in basic research and put their thumb on the scale to encourage the growth of certain types of markets. In the 50s, it was electronics, and particularly miniaturized electronics. Now I would, if I were advising Joe Biden and he was going to do everything I told him to do, neither of those things would happen. But, I think there's an opportunity with energy transition and further doubling down and investing on climate related technologies, because the market's not going to be able to do that, have the inclination, the ability, or the resources to do it on their own. I think it's interesting to think about, are we at a similar inflection point as, the transistor, 1947, isn't co-invented in 1947. That was like the steam engine, right? It set off this entirely new thing. I think everyone's now looking for the next steam engine. Is it AI? Is it ML? Is it just a better battery for an electric vehicle? What is the thing? And there's also, companies are trying to position things as the next big thing. Is it Web3? Is it the metaverse, which at the moment seems like just an exercise in branding? Again, I'm a historian. I look backwards, not forwards, but I'm really curious to see where or what that technological inflection point, where it lands and what it is, because it's not quite legible to me which of these things is going.
I love the framing of this being a technological inflection point. And I think yet again, like some of the previous moments you've talked about, you do have these two tech ideas in tension with one another, that quantum computing and machine learning and large-scale AI are big industrial practices that require huge capital, and even the metaverse. I mean, the reason Facebook can do the metaverse is because they're going to spend $20 billion on it. And it's a big project, and it's highly centralized. And you have that sitting in parallel with all the Web3 rhetoric and innovation that's happening that is espousing a very different idea of... So how do you see those two things sitting side by side?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that they sit side by side,
because it's happened before.
I mean, in a way, it's this fundamental tension that's characterized Silicon Valley from the very beginning, which is it has been a place defined by bigness, whether it was big government, big companies. The biggest employer in Silicon Valley from the mid-50s through the end of the 80s was Lockheed, the defense contractor. But there's been bigness and even big capital. Like the first VC funds were funded by Rockefeller money and Whitney money, like old Gilded Age money. And that's been there ever, always. But it has had this small is beautiful. We're different, more agile, we're more entrepreneurial from the very beginning, even before the countercultural days of the 60s, where, again, go back to Bill and Dave, the Hewlett Packard, like they're like, we want to have the ethos of the engineering lab, not of the big corporation. There's this really interesting real dislike of and unwillingness to acknowledge bigness. And I think in terms of the consumers and users of tech too. The tech, we are disquieted by how big these companies have become. And they are extraordinarily large and highly capitalized. We do have the richest people in the history of the planet and some of the most
the largest companies in
the biggest market caps the market's ever seen. It's okay to be disquieted, but you're exactly right. Where the technology is going, and Web3, I'm very curious to see where that evolves. I see the philosophy animating it is very familiar. It's the philosophy that was behind the personal computer movement, that was behind the early days of the internet.
I mean, I wonder if you mentioned the sort of crypto space and Russia here, and we had a similar situation in Canada with these truckers protests recently, where, I mean, the federal government essentially used the most powerful piece of legislation it has, which is this kind of Federal Emergencies Act, in large part to stop the money flowing into Canada through these various crypto funds. So I think some of these new technologies that sit within this Web3 ecosystem could sort of manifest as being deeply antagonistic to the state and threatening to the state.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the ideological origins of crypto come from an extraordinarily anti-statist, not, techno-libertarianism, but also inflected with, the control of the money has been something that's been a, populist goal since the days of the 1880s and the Grange and William Jennings Bryan and, Cross of Gold and free silver. It's sort of argument over how do you increase the money supply so the little guy has a piece. That's really what it is. And here's the irony is that movement, if we go back to the 19th century, why are the farmers and the small business people of the Great Plains of the United States so up in arms or up in pitchforks about this and wanting to change monetary policy and practice? It's because of this mostly unregulated banking system where there isn't a Federal Reserve, where there are very little banking rules, and where there's incredible volatility in the market that is slamming small farmers. So that's the sort of interesting kind of this question of crypto's allure is its unregulated nature. But you kind of have to regulate it in order to protect those who are part of participating in that economy, including and especially the little guys.
The retail investors, right? Who are,
Yeah, I'm bemused. The thing that worries me, what makes me so curious about the larger Web3 evangelism is that many of the loudest voices and evangelists are people who are very, very wealthy, people who already have done very well in the tech industry. They're prominent venture capitalists and others. And oftentimes the new technologies, the new disruptive ideas have come from the fringe by the people who were not part of the system. And that's not to say that the people who've been successful can't have good ideas, but I'm confused by the end game here. Like, who's going to make money at the end of the day? And how can the system be something where there's something productive comes out of that, productive technologies come out of it, as well as systems of access and finance.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be another theme that consistently emerges through this history is the empowerment of the outsider and the little guy. At the same time as behind the scenes, there seems to always be large-scale institutional people benefiting from this. I mean, the establishment has never been very far away from Silicon Valley, frankly.
Yeah, and it can be very, it can work in both productive and less productive ways. I've spent a lot of time talking to octogenarian venture capitalists when I was writing my book, which was lovely. And really, I learned so much from them. But one of the things that I was really struck by was how almost to a person or to a man, they were all white men. But they were from pretty humble backgrounds. They were scholarship kids. They were small town boys from Iowa and South Carolina and Texas. They worked their way through college. They ended up in California because they didn't have family connections and didn't have resources. They came out to take advantage of an opportunity. All they had was a, good engineering degree and a work ethic. And then they end up, doing very, very well. And that is something that's another dimension of the story where when you do have these big institutions with resources, they can provide a foundation for individuals to have a extraordinary economic and other opportunities to realize their potential, so to speak. But they can't do it alone. The pull yourself up by your bootstraps is an American myth that's very corrosive. There are very, very few truly self-made people. And it also was one, if you look back to the 50s and 60s, of course, the beneficiaries of that great wave of spending were overwhelmingly male, native-born, white Americans. And that, it is one thing that's contributed to a continuing homogeneity of the industry at its higher levels and investment class to this day. It's kind of replicated itself in ways that I think ultimately are not good, not just bad for society, but it's also kind of ultimately the good ideas are become limited when you only have a rather narrow demographic producing them.
Look, just to close here, I had one sort of slightly different thought to run by you. You mentioned this quote by Steve Jobs that says, when we invented the personal computer, we created a new kind of bicycle. And part of what he's getting at here is that they were inventing something that were improving our cognitive capacity. Like they were making our mind better, and they were making life easier in a way. They were replacing mundane tasks. They were helping us do things we couldn't otherwise do. And I recently spoke to Johann Hari, who has this book about the attention crisis we're currently in. So that's been really on my mind lately. And there's a pretty convincing school of thought that computers are making us dumber now, not smarter. I mean, they're taking something from us, not being additive to our capacities. And I wonder if you think that is a transition, and what we can look to now to kind of get some of that back, to have these technologies work for us. And is there anything from history that tells us how we can create those incentives properly to realign them with human interests?
I would love that too. I mean, we all suffer from what Alvin Toffler memorably labeled information overload. And that was in 1970. So this is not a new phenomenon, kind of the dizzying onslaught of new media and things designed to capture the mind's attention, which the television age was already freaking people out by its ability to do that. And in 1970, and now in the 2020s, we're like, holy cow, they didn't even know the half of it. I think there's, when does it, how do we get it back? That's a great question. I think that the next technological challenge is both to make our interface with screens more harmonious and measured in terms of keeping pace with the pace of the human neurons' ability to process things and helping restore our attention. So slowing things down a bit. The challenge is that the high intensity, high engagement model is the most lucrative model. One of the Silicon Valley or the tech industry, the habit is to say, well, there must be a better tech for that. There must be an app for that. We need to develop better technology. And I think even big tech critics, lawmakers in the United States who want to regulate it, they still will say, can't you just fix the Facebook algorithm so the newsfeed's better? And I would push back and say, well, maybe there's not a technological fix. It's a human fix too. It's also, one reason that we are drawn so much to screens is not, well, certainly in the last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, out of necessity, but also, I think I found myself on social media more in the last 2 years, in part because we didn't have other ways of human connection and contact. And one of the great success of these social platforms has been in part because in so many places around the world, there have been, diminished ties, community ties, supports. People are more mobile. People are displaced. There is less economic security, social security, broadly defined. And the absence of those things have created human needs that need to be met and have been met through some of these platforms. So I think there's a whole world solution there that's not just technology. It's not an easy fix. I wish I had this there's an app for that.
Yeah.
But I'm intrigued to see what happens next, because in 10 years, this conversation will be very different. But we don't know what kind of different, but we will have different platforms and products that are at the forefront of our consciousness, and maybe they'll be designed differently. Who knows?
Yeah, and maybe pausing a bit and slowing down and looking at how we've developed previous technologies helps us think a little bit more carefully about the next thing we build. So, yeah. Thank you for doing that.
Oh, it was great talking to you. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed being here.
That was my conversation with Margaret O'Mara. As always, you can reach me at taylor@bigtechpodcast.com. Big Tech is presented by the Center for International Governance Innovation in association with Antica Productions. The show is produced by Trevor Hunsberger, Gabby Pacheco, and Mitchell Stewart, with associate producer Abi Raheja. Please consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We release new episodes on Thursdays every week.